This is Rick, and I'm going to talk about language and prescriptive grammar. Just get this into full screen, there we go. And really it's a way to think about language that's probably a little bit different than most of you have experienced before. For many people, talking about the word grammar at all can be pretty stressful. That's because many of us have been sort of told that the way that we talk or write is somehow deficient, and it's really based on a different way of thinking about grammar, one that is very prescriptive in nature. This is the sort of standard way of thinking about it. That grammar is something that you learn consciously, probably through school, and that we have conscious control over at all times, and also includes sort of implicit value judgments and all sorts of stuff. So even though we seem to be able to make ourselves understood, we're often told that we don't know our language completely. But what is language really? Language is a code that humans use to communicate. This can take the form of either speech or sign. These are the two primary modes of language. And usually if I'm talking about speech, even though I don't say it explicitly, I mean speech and sign together, typically. So here's a sort of model of what's happening. We have ideas, we can pack those into a certain kind of code that allows us to transmit them through sound waves to another person, who can then take those sound waves, decode the structure, and unpack the message that I sent them. If you think about it, this is an incredibly remarkable skill. It is something that's quite sophisticated, and we really don't understand everything about how it works. If we did, we would have much better machines for understanding people. And sometimes talking about language is a little bit like talking about the water that we swim in. It's so ubiquitous, and we really barely stop to think about it. So that's really what taking any kind of linguistics class causes you to do, is really bring focus on language and think about it in a scientific way. And it takes a certain kind of ability to do that, to say, look, here's this thing that I've always just sort of considered to be natural and taken for granted, and ask why it works the way it works. So why does the apple fall down and not up? If we don't ask those questions, which seem obvious, which may have seemed obvious, then we're not really doing science. But when we start to ask the questions that have those kinds of obvious answers, then we really are getting somewhere. So here's a interesting news flash. Dolphins don't swim properly. Pandas hold bamboo in the wrong paw. Monkeys cries in a state of chaos. Bird's nest incorrectly constructed. Songs of the humpback whale known to contain several errors. Now, this is clearly crazy talk. How can you say that something like animal behavior has errors? What does that mean? What would it mean to say that an instinctual behavior is in a state of chaos? How can there be a wrong way if there's no right way? And who made up these rules? Well, it's really the situation that we're in with people talking about grammar and really drawing this line between what we accept as correct grammatical speech as opposed to incorrect speech. So there's lots of different examples of this, but you can pick your favorite. Don't use a double negative. Don't end a sentence in a preposition. Don't split infinitives, and so on. Well, where did these rules come from? Well, in many cases, they're just kind of made up. For example, people thought that Latin was particularly elegant and logical, and so they tried to make English behave like Latin. And so then we get this sort of edict like don't end a sentence in a preposition, which really is just doesn't occur in Latin because of the structure of the language, but in English it's a perfectly natural thing to do. Kind of a crazy thing to think about. Latin is an inflected language, and so things like prepositions are really incorporated as a part of the word, and so you can't end a sentence in a preposition basically in Latin, nor can you split infinitives, because infinitives again don't use a to marker. They have an incorporated infinitive form, and so these are really things you can't do in Latin, but and so in order to make English seem more like Latin, they were sort of used as a metric for what's good English. But as Churchill famously said, that is a rule up with which I will not put. So, language is really an instinct, and to say that language, or people, don't speak their language perfectly is just similar to saying that, dolphins don't swim properly. We really think about language as in the same way as we think about the way bats use echolocation, or the way spiders build webs, or geese navigate the stars, or any of these other kinds of animal behaviors. So, echolocation, as an example, is a great analog for thinking about language. It's incredibly sophisticated. It was not invented by humans until World War II. It involves both specialized hardware and software in the brain. Does a very specific job, that is, locating bugs in the dark. And the theory of echolocation is really very complex. There's a wonderful bit of Dawkins's book, is it The Selfish Gene, that goes into detail about echolocation, and it's really quite remarkable how it works. And so you'd expect a theory of it to be quite complex. So what does a theory of language look like? Well, the way that we think about language scientifically, we call descriptive grammar. This is in contrast to prescriptive grammar. Prescriptive grammar is that type we were talking about that we've learned in school, that is about, sort of what's correct speech. And descriptive grammar is really a way of looking at the way language works without changing it, without putting rules onto it, but in a more observational way. Basically what you'd expect if you're undertaking a scientific kind of investigation. You wouldn't, for example, if you were doing some kind of experiment on cells, or on other types of organisms, you wouldn't try to force them to conform to your hypothesis or a model or some sort of predetermined criterion. You would just observe what happened. That's the only way you can really do science without introducing really terrible confounds into your method. And in linguistics, we think of language as something we're trying to describe. So think about language as if you were an alien from another planet. What's the most interesting thing you would notice about this? Well, one of the first things is that everybody knows their language perfectly. There's no such thing as incorrect language in the sense of ungrammatical person not having complete knowledge of their own language, person who's neurologically intact. The other thing you'd notice is that the language, the knowledge is not accessible. It's not consciously accessible. It is all happening behind the scenes usually. A good way to think about it is the way Pinker describes it is, think about the way your body digests food. It's something it does, it knows how to do, and you don't necessarily have to know consciously how that works. You can study it, you can learn about how that works, but it goes on perfectly well without you needing to learn about it. And in fact, that's the way most people are. They don't think really about what are the particulars of how food is digested and metabolized, but the body knows how to do it. So, other things you would notice about language is that it appears to be entirely unique to humans. Babies are tuned to learn language. In fact, they begin learning language before they're even born. There are interesting set of experiments that show that children are sensitive to intonation contours that they've heard in utero, so they start that process quite early. Just like children learn how to learn language is similar to the way that birds learn how to fly, spiders spin webs, fish learn how to swim, and children learn how to talk. It's a species-wide behavior, and it's incredibly uniform across the species. There seems to be a critical period for language. So if children don't learn language by a certain age, then it is much more difficult for them to do so. Although some adults do seem to maintain this ability later into life, that seems to be somewhat of an anomaly. For the vast majority of everyone, there's changes that happen in the brain because of hormonal changes in the body around puberty that really change the way learning works altogether. And it makes it much more difficult to learn a language natively. Special parts are involved in the brain. Strokes, evidence from strokes shows us that there are specific parts of the brain that are devoted to language function, and if those are damaged, there are quite particular losses that we can show and demonstrate in stroke patients, and that don't have anything to do with intelligence. And so language and thought are really quite different things. Language is, if you want to think about it, it's really an input-output device. Thinking is something that's happening at a different level in the brain, uses different hardware, and is not crucially tied to language. As I said, speech is the primary mode of communication, writing is really derivative. It is parasitic on language. It requires on speech. It requires speech. It's really just encoded speech, speech made visible. The communications that usually concern, us, a few social sort of communications that have to be sorted out among the species, who's the big dog and who's the little dog, and that sort of thing. We've gone through a series of experiments to try to teach language to other species. This has been entirely unsuccessful, contrary to many popular claims. That other primates can learn names for things and reproduce them, but in terms of learning the core aspects of language like syntax, there's no evidence really that any of that has been able to be transferred to another species. So while they can develop a pretty large vocabulary for various objects, they don't have the basic hardware and software in order to compute language the way that humans do. And as I said, language is not the same as intelligence. So having language doesn't make you smart. So there's some many well documented cases of children with Williams syndrome that are hyperfluent in language and yet can't perform the daily tasks of feeding themselves or riding a bus. They have an attraction to complex language. They love interesting words, and yet they have very, very low IQ. Conversely, we know that there are cases like stroke victims where language is impaired and yet intelligence is perfectly normal. So that's what we would call a dissociation, a double dissociation. So we have the case of language without intelligence in the case of Williams syndrome, and intelligence without language in the case of stroke victims, or the case of Jeannie, for example, who was experienced isolation through puberty and did not acquire language, and yet had the ability to learn, and her IQ grew every year after she was rescued from her isolation. So, as I said, Williams syndrome. And if you think about, even just thinking about typical toddlers, so my 2.5-year-old can talk a blue streak, but he can't add or subtract or multiply or drive a car or vote. And if I asked him to make scrambled eggs, he wouldn't have the foggiest idea how to do that. But he has incredible language skills. I'd say his language skills are almost, mature at 2.5. So it's just shocking, actually, how rapid that knowledge is acquired, and how little it has to do with what we think of as intelligence. Also other species demonstrate great intelligence. They actually have been able to demonstrate, rudimentary mathematical abilities and great spatial and problem-solving abilities, and yet they don't have the equipment to learn language, even though we've tried very hard to teach it to them. So, language really depends on having the both the hardware and the software built in to perform the functions at these levels of description. And that is phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. These are the parts of language, the theory, that are required really to give a complete description of how language is, how it works and how it's used. And this is all really about hooking up two things that are very, very different, meaning on the one hand and sound on the other. So syntax is sort of the core of that. Syntax and morphology mediate that connection and are the core aspect of language that is particular to humans. There's a lot of I would say urban myths about language that sort of fit nicely into the category of language and thought and identifying the two and or ways in which language affects thought, really. This is also called the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, and it really boils down to language being determinative for certain kinds of thoughts. So one example of that is the sort of story about how many words for snow do Eskimos have. Well, they must have a lot of words for snow because of the environment they live in, and that's somehow creating mental patterns, and it turns out that is all made up. There was never any kind of scientific study which said that Eskimos have. That was a case of sort of mass hysteria that because of the sort of intuitiveness of thinking that they must have, you know, huge amount of vocabulary to refer to snow. Language is complex, and the theory is, but not for lack of trying. And if somebody were able to figure this out, they would be quite wealthy. This is the, you know, one of the things that would fundamentally change the relationship between humans and computers. And, you know, what I think people desperately want is that to be a more natural kind of relationship. And so there's a lot of work going on in this, and still we don't have a complete understanding of how to understand speech in a natural context. As I said, language is learned incredibly fast and uniformly across the species with almost no effort. Writing is secondary. There's been no humans ever existed without having language and speech. Yet lots of languages have never had a writing system. So language learning occurs long before we learn how to write in school. The way I like to think about it is language is biology and reading is technology. So reading is a bit of aftermarket technology that's bolted on to the language system and cobbles together a whole bunch of brain systems that were not specifically designed to do that. So what I'm saying is that grammar, our core knowledge of language, is innate, and that this has been perceived as radical by some, but if you think about it, it really makes a lot more sense than the alternative, which is that no part of language is innate and that it's entirely learned. That is a very lopsided kind of an account, where everything would have to be in the environment for humans to learn language. and is very unlikely to be true. Whereas having a more balanced kind of approach where you have some part of language which is innate and some part which is learned actually makes a lot more sense. That's a much more, as I said, balanced kind of an approach that uses both innate and learned knowledge in order to account for such a complex system. So when we talk about language, sort of bringing this back around to the whole notion of prescriptivism and the way that we think about language and grammar, English has a couple different meanings. It can refer to that particular dialect that's dominant within a country, like English is the language of the US. It can also refer to a group of related dialects, none of which has really status as the standard language, like English is spoken in many parts of the world. But in this sense, you know, whether we call something a language or a dialect is really kind of a moot point. Linguists don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. Typically we are studying dialects, some of which have been labeled as language. This is sort of like, you know, is it a language, is it a dialect? It's like arguing about whether or not Pluto is a planet or not. Is Greenland an island or a continent, and so on. There are sort of examples of where you could argue both sides of that. In China, there are a lot of dialects, and some dialects are not mutually intelligible. For example, Mandarin and Cantonese are less than 50% mutually intelligible, and yet we still call it all Chinese. We sort of refer to it as the Chinese language. Conversely, there are dialects of Dutch in the eastern part of Holland and dialects of German in the western part of Germany, which have high degree of intelligibility, and yet we refer to those as two different languages, Dutch and German. So you can see that whether or not we call something a language is really about politics more than anything else. We have a variety of dialects within the United States, although our diversity of dialects is fairly limited compared to other countries. So this distinction between language and dialect is really not something that linguists spend much time thinking about. It's really a power relationship, whether or not something gets to be called a language, and is sort of bolstered by other kinds of factors like business, education, government, and religion, whether or not something that is a dialect acquires language status. This was summarized succinctly by one linguist who said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So what we call a language is probably something that has status as a state-supported language, a dialect that's supported by a state, but is not really something that we think about as important in terms of it's a different dialect than you. And how much sense does that make for them to tell you that your dialect is wrong? That's really more of a cultural thing than anything else. and I think is somewhat silly. Now, understanding standard American English can be obviously beneficial, or having command of the sort of academic dialect can absolutely be important. But thinking about it in terms of dialects can be really helpful. You know, there are dialects that we have learned, regional dialects that are perfectly natural and expressive and important, that are different than that, and it's nonsensical to be told that those are in some way inferior versions of the standard language. So we can master different dialects, and it's important sometimes to do so. So if we want to participate in business or in academic work, or to be perceived as a part of the mainstream, then we would clearly want to use those dialects. But that's really leaving the value judgments behind. Conventions are important, and we should use them when they are useful. Okay, I hope that this helps sort of clarify the landscape around the work that we do in linguistics, and sort of gives you a perspective about how we approach language and think about it as linguists.